So now that we have an understanding of kind of the big picture, painting in very broad strokes related to the history of schooling in this country, let's talk about the history of special education. The first time that we see special education mentioned or students with disabilities mentioned is in a White House Commission on Children, and the year was 1910. And so during this commission, this big meeting of people across the country who were involved with children, we began to see a public mention of students with disabilities. Starting in the 1700s, first in France and then around the world, we institutionalized our students with disabilities. People that were born with disabilities were often sent to institutions at birth, not to really be thought of again by their families or by society. We hid those people from society. We think about institutionalization not within an institution, but people with disabilities being hidden from society. In the novel by Harper Lee called To Kill a Mockingbird, Boo Radley is this example of a mysterious person within a community. It's not a big leap to think of him as someone with a disability. Anytime anything went wrong in that town, it was blamed on Boo Radley. Even if there was evidence that someone else had done the thing, it was still blamed on him. And this was very much our perspective on those with disabilities. It was this Calvinistic perspective that having a child with a disability was God punishing you for something you'd or your family had done wrong now or in the past. And that was our perspective for a long time. And so as we move into the 1920s, we largely see sort of a stall in progressive ideas in schools and new ideas in schools due to the Great Depression and then World War II. And so it's not until the 1950s that we get back to public education in a real way. There's two events in 1957 that really, I think, springboards things as it relates to these ideas. But we have to start first in 1954 with the landmark Supreme Court decision Brown versus the Board of Education. I see this as the first real springboard towards equal rights for those with disabilities in public schooling, and not in a way that I'm particularly proud of. When Brown was decided, I certainly look back at Brown, something that was decided 24 or 25 years before I was born, as kind of a no-brainer. Like, of course everybody should go to school together. Of course there shouldn't be segregation. But this wasn't the predominant attitude in the early 1950s when this law was decided. There were people who were very anti everyone going to school together. And I think the beginnings of the disability rights movement start at dining room tables when a family has a child with a disability and thinks that this other group of people can now go to school with my children, but their brother or their sister can't because of a disability. And so we see Brown. In 1957, we see the Little Rock Nine. So in late September, 9 African American students are forcibly integrated by the Arkansas National Guard into Little Rock High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. And this becomes the symbolic beginning of a movement when we talk about access to education. Does everyone have access to education? In 1957, also just a few weeks later, in early October, the Russians launched the Sputnik artificial satellite into space. This becomes the symbolic beginning of our conversation about what we're doing in public schools, and is it adequate? Are we doing the things that we really need to do? Is the educational product, if we think in terms of economics, is the basket of goods of a public education good enough for our students? And of course, private education is evolving right alongside public education at this time. And so in 1957, this begins a new conversation. In 1958, we see the National Education Defense Act. This is a movement towards training high school teachers so that they can identify the best and the brightest, get those kids to college and graduate school so they can become scientists and engineers. We're in the middle of the space race and the Cold War. And so this creates a chasm, because if the job of schools is to educate the best and the brightest, what does that do for the weakest, right? For the slow learners, for the students with disabilities. In the 1960s, President Johnson ushers in the Great Society movement. The education portion of that movement was called the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. This is the first federal law that has to do with governing schools in the country. We called it ESEA in 1965. In 2001, the same law was renamed No Child Left Behind, and today that law is called the Every Student Succeeds Act. In 56, so Johnson's idea with ESEA was to end poverty and to provide extra resources for schools that educated students from poverty. What the schools did with the money was not what was intended, and so in 1966 the law was reauthorized and it introduced federal accountability measures, proof that those schools needed to provide the government to show that they were actually educating students from poverty with the money designed to educate students with needs and not to buy football helmets. And our private schools are beneficiaries of those funds. Any school that uses Title funds or Title I funds, those were funds that began to be set aside from ESEA. In 1966, in that reauthorization, there was also mention of support for students with disabilities. Coming shortly after that, we have a pair of Supreme Court decisions, both in 1971 and 1972. The first is Park versus Pennsylvania. Park's an acronym. It was the Pennsylvania Associated for Retarded Children. Today we call that organization ARC. This Supreme Court decision said that all students in Pennsylvania who were mentally retarded had a right to a free and appropriate public education. This term FAPE, free and appropriate public education. Later in the Mills decision, in Washington, D.C., the Supreme Court decided that it wasn't just students with mental retardation, but students with all disabilities that should have access to this free, appropriate, and public education. 3 years later, in 1975, we have what we call PL 94-142, or the Education for All Handicapped Children Act, what we today call the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA. This is special ed law, reauthorized over time. In 1993, it became IDEA. This is the law that governs special education. The last time this law was reauthorized was 2004. It needs to be reauthorized again. It hasn't been reauthorized in quite some time. It's more than 16 years now, and so we're waiting for Congress to get to work on that. And so that's a kind of a brief history of the laws and some of the social actions that lead us to special education in 1975 and continuing today.